quote that will help you to see how Jonathan Edwards is looking at the moving of the Spirit of God in his day, where that quotation said, he says, in the soul where Christ savingly is, there he lives. He not only lives without it, so as violently to actuate it, but he lives in it so that the soul also is alive. Grace in the soul is as much from Christ as the light in a glass held out in the sunbeams is from the sun. But this represents the manner of the communication of grace to the soul only in part, because the glass remains as it was, the nature of it not being at all changed. It is as much without any lightsomeness in its nature as ever. But the soul of a saint receives light from the Sun of Righteousness in such a manner that its nature is changed, and it becomes properly a luminous thing. Not only does the sun shine in the saints, but they also become little suns, partaking of the nature of the fountain of their light. In this respect, the manner of their derivation of light is like that of the lamps in the tabernacle, rather than that of a reflecting glass, which though they were lit up by fire from heaven, yet thereby become themselves burning, shining things. So you see there, he's trying to get this idea of, the light that hits glass and reflects it, that glass doesn't change at all, right? It just performs a function unaltered. But when you take the fire from the sun, you light a candle in the tabernacle, that heat and light, actually, now that candle is doing something because it's participating in that fire from heaven, so to speak. And he's saying the Spirit functions that way with us, that we are changed and we become luminaries through that. So very interesting how he brings that out. So we'll let Dr. Godfrey do his thing. We'll go through the questions, and then I'll have a couple of things that I want to share with you. So let's...
Well, last time we were looking at the Great Awakening, arguably one of the most important events in the history of North America. And we had looked both at the profound impact it had on people at the time, where many, many people were converted all over the American colonies, but also the way in which it was a revolution that began to change church life in America. Not everyone recognized that huge change immediately, of course, but there are unintended consequences of actions. I don't think Edwards or even Whitefield really intended to undermine the standing order of the Congregational way in New England, to undermine the parish system or the authority of ministers. But it really began the ball rolling that would lead to what has been described as the triumph of the laity in America. And when Europeans come to America today, one of the things they observe is how much the laity are involved in the life of the church, how much influence they have in the life of the church. And of course that influence is, if you don't like it here, you can walk down the block. And an awful lot of Americans not only believe that, but act on that basis. And as a result, the ministers always have a sense they have to listen to the laity. Sometimes, unfortunately, ministers believe they have to let the laity roll over them. But in any case, it has created a church environment where there is much more activity on the part of the laity. You go to Europe, by contrast, where there are still state churches, in Germany, for example, and there the churches are almost empty, and the ministers are still paid because they're paid by the state. And so the entrepreneurial spirit of America, both for better and for worse, because it has both sides to it, really triumphed, and that whole direction was set in motion by what happened in the Great Awakening. It doesn't really come into its own until the 19th century. We'll talk a lot more about it in the next series on church history we're going to do, but that's part of the importance of the Great Awakening. It begins a dramatic change in the life of America. Now, I've said that one of the important preachers in the Great Awakening was Jonathan Edwards, and probably you're familiar with that name. Many people have argued that Jonathan Edwards is the smartest American who ever lived, that he had the best brain, that he was the most brilliant man who ever lived. And of course, that's the kind of thing that's kind of hard to judge, but there can be no doubt that Jonathan Edwards was a truly brilliant man. He was born in 1703 in Connecticut. His father was a Puritan minister, and Jonathan Edwards grew up showing early on that brilliance. He went to Yale College. Yale had been started in 1701 because Harvard had gone liberal. And it's amazing how colleges don't necessarily last too long. Harvard was only about, 60 years old. And the conservative ministers in Connecticut were already worried about what was happening at Harvard, so they started Yale. Yale was the third, I think, college in America, and the second was William and Mary in Virginia, but or the proper name was the Royal College of Their Majesties King William and Queen Mary. They shortened it later to William and Mary, but Yale was also then a Calvinist school. To maintain Calvinist orthodoxy, to train Calvinist clergy. And that's what Jonathan Edwards did when he went there to study. He describes how, as a young man, he was converted, and he describes how that conversion took place by his being overwhelmed by a sense of the beauty of God and the glory of God in nature. And he wrote about that in his personal narrative of his conversion. And he went home to tell his father about that and to join the Congregational Church in Connecticut, and his father would not let him join. His father did not think this was an adequate narration of conversion. Adequate conversion narratives were about being crushed by the law, not about seeing the glory and beauty of God in nature. We don't know exactly when Jonathan Edwards joined the church, but it shows early on that Jonathan Edwards was a bit of an exception to the way Puritans normally did things, and that his father was a staunch example of the old Puritan way of doing things. Had a huge impact on Jonathan Edwards. In any case, he went to accompany his grandfather, as I mentioned before, in the ministry in Northampton, west of Boston. In those days, it was way west of Boston. Today, it would take about an hour to drive, if that. But in those days, it was a long journey. And he went in 1725 and worked with his grandfather, his maternal grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. And then in 1729, Stoddard died, and Edwards had to take over the responsibility for the congregation. And he saw, as we already talked about in the 30s, some stirrings in the congregation. And then he saw wonderful things happening in the congregation as the Great and General Awakening began in the 1740s. And Edwards was excited about what he saw happening. He records much of what he saw and experienced in a variety of works that he wrote. One of the most important for us was written in 1739 and not published in his own lifetime. He kept it to himself, and he entitled it A History of the Work of Redemption. And in that work, already just at the beginning of the Great Awakening, 1739, he raised the question, how is God going to work through history? Edwards was a strong postmillennialist. He was a strong believer that Christ would glorify his church. He was a strong believer that the Pope was Antichrist and that the fall of Antichrist was coming in the next few decades. But how is God going to work? And he argues in this work on the history of the work of redemption that God has always worked primarily through revivals. And he said, I anticipate what's going to happen until Christ comes again to glorify his church, that we'll see the church raised through a revival and then fall again. And then the church will be raised to even greater heights through a revival and then fall again. And then we'll see the church raised to even greater heights. And at one of those high points, Christ will come again. That's what Edwards anticipated. And that's what he thought was happening with the coming of the Great Awakening. And by 1743, he could be talking about how it seemed that almost everyone in Northampton had been converted, and that the level of spiritual interest and committedness and sincerity was so profound that Edwards wrote then that if this state of things were to continue, it might well be that this was the beginning of the millennial glory. Now, he was later accused of having taught that the millennium had actually begun. He never taught that. He never said that. But in 1743, things had reached such a high point that he could actually entertain the notion, maybe we're almost there. But what's important about Edwards as a witness to the awakening is that he helped establish in the psyche of American religion the idea that God works through revivals, and that God works often through great preachers. And many American evangelicals from that time to this have asked the question, well, who is the great preacher God's working through today? And if you look at evangelical histories of America in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, what do you see them doing? Often they're focusing first on Whitefield and Edwards as great preachers in the 18th century, and then Finney is often focused on as the great preacher in the early part of the 19th century, and then Dwight L. Moody is the great preacher in the latter part of the 19th century, and Billy Sunday is the great preacher in the early part of the 20th century, and then Billy Graham is the great preacher of the latter part of the 20th century. If you go to the History of American Evangelicalism Museum at Wheaton College, you'll see exactly that story being told with the pictures of the great preachers. I think this is an unfair story because between Billy Sunday and Billy Graham, you would have to talk about Aimee Semple McPherson as the proper carrier of the apostolic torch. We'll talk about that in the next series. But that became the expectation. God does his work primarily through revivals. And I think that's a very wrong notion. It's dangerous to disagree with Jonathan Edwards, but I think he's absolutely wrong about that. God does most of his work through the settled ministry of settled ministers in settled congregations. And that's not to say he doesn't do reviving work, that he doesn't sometimes do great works through individuals outside of churches. I think he does, but we mustn't underestimate the vital importance of the congregation, of the settled ministry, of the gradual growth. And I think Edwards was in a little danger in his postmillennial optimism of doing that. By 1745, Edwards was being forced to acknowledge that the energy, the commitment, the passion for the work of God was diminishing in the colonies. They had not entered the millennial age. And even in Northampton, many of those who had seemed so energetic in their commitment now seemed to be falling back. This was a great discouragement to Edwards. Now, what it meant that people were falling back is difficult to know for sure, because as George Marsden has shown in his wonderful biography of Jonathan Edwards, one of Edwards' problems as a pastor was that he was personally something of a perfectionist. Not a theological perfectionist, but that he was so disciplined himself, so demanding of himself, that he sort of thought all Christians ought to behave that way. He would spend 12 to 13 hours a day in his study, writing and studying. And he really didn't understand why other Christians didn't have that same sort of commitment to study. That same kind of disciplined approach to life. So when Edwards says people aren't as committed as they used to be, that doesn't necessarily mean they've become gross apostates, but it means the level of spiritual interest and spiritual involvement was no longer as strong as it had once been. And this was a personal disappointment to him. And one of the problems it posed for him in Northampton was the whole issue of church membership again. When it seemed like the whole town was converted and passionate for God, it was easy to let all of them become church members. But now, as the passions of revival seemed to be burning lower again, he had to face the question, what are we going to require of people to become church members? And Edwards concluded that he could no longer go along with what his grandfather had taught about the halfway covenant, about the Lord's Supper as a converting ordinance. Jonathan Edwards was moving much more back to what his father had taught him about a strictly examined church membership. And in 1749, he wrote, this is a good example of a Puritan title, he wrote, "A humble inquiry into the rules of the Word of God concerning the qualifications requisite to a complete standing and full communion in the visible church." Usually just referred to as the humble inquiry. And he was raising there this question of church membership, what's required. And he was saying, in there has to be some kind of narrative of grace from experience for church membership. And when he taught this to his congregation, they fired him. In 1750, Edwards was dismissed as the pastor of the church in Northampton. The laity are already in revolt. And actually that was possible in the congregational system. And he went then to be pastor in Stockbridge. And you can journey to Stockbridge today. It's about 2 hours east of Boston. It's a beautiful little town. In those days, it was the Wild West. It was about as far in the frontier as anybody with good sense would want to go. And it was a little town with hunters and a few farmers and Indians. And for someone as dedicated to study as Edwards was, it was not an easy place to find himself or an easy place to work, but he gave himself as sincerely and as hardworking as he could. One of the big problems Edwards had in his work was paper. Paper was a relatively rare and valuable commodity, and some of his writings were literally written on scraps of paper that he would then sew together to try to make use of every tidbit of paper that he possibly could. I occasionally write on the back of envelopes. My wife criticizes me for that, and I say I'm in the spirit of Jonathan Edwards on this point. Waste not, want not. He did some of his great writing there in Stockbridge. In 1754, for example, he wrote, "A careful and strict inquiry into the modern prevailing notions of that freedom of will which is supposed to be essential to moral agency, virtue, and vice, reward, and judgment." His great treatise on the freedom of the will. And here is this remarkable man, one of the great intellects of the era, doing some of the great theological work done in America and trying to bring the brilliance of his mind to the defense of Calvinism, but a defense in a new kind of way, rethinking some of the issues, coming to the defense from different angles in the ways in which the truth had been defended before. And this led to a measure of criticism from a variety of people. One of his critics criticized him for defending the awakening. Edwards responded by saying that if you criticize the awakening, you are committing the sin against the Holy Ghost, doubting his work. But the Boston clergy was divided over the awakening. About 3/4 of them supporting it, 1/4 opposing it. And one of the leaders of the opposition, a minister by the name of Charles Chauncey, said that Edwards had just become an enthusiast, that he thought emotions were real religion. And in response to that, Edwards wrote another of his great treatises, a treatise on religious affections. And this absolutely confirmed Chauncey in all of his beliefs about the radical character of Edwards. But it's an extremely subtle and clever treatise, suggesting a whole different approach to theological anthropology than had ever been pursued before. The trouble was, not everybody could really follow Edwards. Not everybody could really understand Edwards. And Edwards sometimes developed such a distinctive approach on his own that it was kind of hard to figure out exactly what he was saying. My own favorite example of that is Jonathan Edwards on original sin. One of the last great treatises he wrote was on original sin. He had a sense, an almost prophetic sense, that the doctrine of original sin seemed to be under attack. And ironically, after his death, he died after being named president of what would become Princeton College. It was at that time called the College of New Jersey. He was on his way to assume his duties as president of Princeton when he wanted to provide a good example to people by being inoculated against smallpox, and the inoculation killed him. So he died at a relatively young age, early 50s. Seems very young to me. Just before that death, sort of sensing that an attack on original sin was in the air, he wrote his great defense on original sin. But what did he teach about original sin? Well, without getting into all the details, B.B. Warfield and John Murray claim that he taught the immediate imputation of Adam's sin, which was, at Edwards' time, the Orthodox Reformed point of view. Charles Hodge and William Cunningham believe that Edwards taught the immediate imputation of Adam's sin, which would have been a minor error, not a huge error in the minds of most Reformed people at the time. And Samuel Baird and John Gerstner believed that he taught neither of those things, but a new idea of the identity of the sinner with Adam. Now, what's interesting here is you have here 6 brilliant Orthodox Reformed theologians, historian, interpreters who cannot agree amongst themselves what Edwards actually said about original sin. They're all agreed he believed in original sin, but the question is exactly how was he teaching it? And this is something of the uniqueness of Edwards and the difficulty of Edwards. Mark Noll, a very distinguished American church historian right now, once said that the Orthodox loved Edwards because of the conclusions he reached. The unorthodox loved him because of the methods that he used. So he becomes this huge, brilliant figure of great influence, but with a mind so brilliant that it goes in new directions that the church has trouble absorbing, but allows him to then be quoted in a variety of different ways by different people who follow him. So there's no doubt that he was a great theologian. There's no doubt that he was a great influence. There's no doubt that he was certainly one of the most brilliant minds America ever produced. And there's no doubt there's been a significant revival of interest in Edwards in the last 30, 40 years amongst American evangelicals. My advice to you, R.C. will probably remove this from the tape, my advice to you is read John Calvin rather than Jonathan Edwards. John Calvin's much more readable in the first place, but I think John Calvin's also more reliable. It's not that Edwards is greatly unreliable, but he has such a distinctive vocabulary, even on the doctrine of justification. He says some very peculiar things in the treatise that he wrote early on in his, well, not early on, but before the Great Awakening on justification. He was a great man, and there's great profit to be derived from a careful study of Jonathan Edwards. But I think the church today needs not to so much look back to Edwards, but I think we're much better off if we look back to Calvin. I have not personally seen the need for theologians after Calvin, but apparently there are needs for theologians. But Calvin, I think in the end of the day, had a much more balanced theology. And as great as Edwards was, I think Calvin may not have been as great a thinker and certainly was not as creative as Edwards, but I think is a much more reliable pastor and teacher for the church.
All righty. Well, any comments before we get into the questions or questions about what Dr. Godfrey had to present today? Yeah, I really enjoyed Dr. Godfrey as a professor. His lecturing style just was really rich. I wish I was a little better student, but probably one of the dark spots in Westminster's history was having me as a student there. But anyhow, grown a great deal since then, and just have a deep appreciation for him. Dr. Horton came out my senior year and took over a lot of Dr. Godfrey's lectures, and I'm saddened that I missed a lot of that. But anyhow, let's go through the study questions. Number one, one of these was started because Harvard had embraced liberal ideas. Was it Yale, Princeton, William and Mary, or Brown? Yale. Jonathan Edwards described his conversion as taking place when he was overwhelmed by a sense of beauty and glory in God's nature. Is that true or false? That's true. Edwards' millennial views were strongly premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, panmillennial. Postmill. Edwards taught that the millennium had actually begun in 1740s. True or false? Does anybody say true there? Good, you all caught that. There was a very careful distinction. Does anybody want to try to articulate what is said about Edwards that was not true, that Godfrey brought out there? Yeah. What's that? What's that? No, you're not going to go for it, huh? Okay. Yeah, so he taught that what he was seeing could be the beginning of the millennial glory, but he didn't argue it was the beginning of a millennial period of time, right? He had the view kind of like we would say the stock market that goes up and down, and that there's going to be a high point in history at some time, and what he was seeing could be the high point that Christ might come in, but never taught that was sort of the beginning of this 1,000-year reign on earth. Okay, all right. 5, the reason Edwards was fired from his church was tied to his view on the millennium, predestination, church membership, or elder oversight. Church membership, yeah, that's right. Because so much of Northampton was being what appeared to be converted, they would take anybody into membership. Remember, his father or his grandfather was tying things to the Lord's Supper, right? If you just partook in the Lord's Supper, you could be a member. Saw that as a converting sort of ordinance, but his father was more of that you need to demonstrate that you understand the gospel. It was more that rational thing. So I think what Godfrey's criticism of Jonathan Edwards would be, he would very much take Jonathan Edwards' father's position of the rational, intellectual, doctrinal sort of dimension to Christianity for church membership and true Christianity, and that the emotional side of things was very much diminished, perhaps too diminished. This is where Godfrey, I think, would be more comfortable over there, and where I think most of Reformed theology is today. We have a few breakouts of things where, we might say the emotional side of things has really taken the broad church over to where doctrine, rationality, systematizing the doctrines is very sort of passé. It is de-emphasized or criticized, where Christianity is more of an inward, emotional, spiritual thing, and that's really heightened in our day, I would argue. But I think somewhere in the middle of this, we have to recognize there is the balance of the rational and the emotional. I think Edwards is bringing that emotion and spiritual indwelling dimension to the Reformed understanding of things. I think he's challenging that. And how to keep the right balance is going to be very difficult for everyone. I think it was Plato who once said that between the emotional and the rational, that the rational is the rider on the horse, that he's the one that controls the horse. And it should never be that the emotions, the subjective, is the rider, and the objective, the doctrinal, the rational, is the horse. So you want the objectivity, I guess, and the rational, I would argue, to be that rider that controls the emotions. So I think that would be what we could agree upon to avoid some of the excesses of, just total subjectivity in the church, I guess. So there are a few things that I wanted to talk about in the time that we have left. Aimee Semple McPherson. I believe Godfrey did his doctoral thesis on Aimee Semple McPherson. So at Westminster, there was this undercurrent of Aimee Semple McPherson that if you didn't have some recognition of Aimee Semple McPherson, Godfrey would somehow take that as a personal kind of dig on him. So some of his lectures have to do with his work there, obviously. And I remember one graduating class decided that everyone was going to have a piece of paper with Aimee Semple McPherson's name on it. And at graduation, when they shook his hand, they put this piece of paper into his hand. So in the video, you can see Dr. Godfrey keeping, these papers, has to keep packing his pocket full of these papers that said Aimee Semple McPherson on it. It was pretty funny. So we'll see if the next lecture brings that out. The example of Jonathan Edwards on the horse, where he would go out on horseback, and times of meditation, and these pieces of paper that he would write on that Dr. Godfrey mentioned. He would rip the margins of his books to get those little scraps of paper, because paper was very hard to come by. And he would pin these little slips of paper to his coat. And one description of him coming back from some of these rides out in the woods would be that it looked like he had been through a snowstorm, because he had so many bits of paper on him. Now, he wrote quite a bit. In fact, there is a collected works of Jonathan Edwards, very deep, and you can imagine, this kind of work. When you look at it, it's double columns in about size 8 font, so very, very dense. So this is available. Banner of Truth, I think, did this one. But of course, that's only half the story. It's in 2 volumes. So Dr. Gerstner, when he was alive, he had done a vast work on Jonathan Edwards, wrote a whole commentary on him, or several volumes. And he offered a set of that for free, that he would actually purchase that collection to anyone who would make a vow before God that they would read both volumes cover to cover. And so if you wanted that, that was available. I don't know that Ligonier would be honoring that anymore, but that was no. Actually, how did I get that? It was given to me. I did not purchase it. But I can't remember if I got that. Maybe Ken Thurston, when he died, he gave me the first take of his thing. So yeah, just recently. And then of course, you know Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," available. Highly recommend that. If you've never read that sermon, it's really just a rich testimony of how God himself is the only thing that restrains God from bringing judgment upon us at any moment is himself. That he alone restrains himself. Just really kind of a rich thing. And one last thing, I don't know that I'd have time to read this, but he famously wrote early on in his life, he wrote 70 resolutions that he posted and reflected upon these resolutions that he would live by. And so I've got about 5 minutes. I didn't time myself to read this, but I thought I'd read those resolutions for you to just kind of get into the mentality and caliber of Jonathan Edwards and where his heart was with God. So he resigned himself to reading over these resolutions once a week. So number 1, resolved that I will do whatever I think to be most to the glory of God and my own good profit and pleasure in the whole of my duration, without any consideration of the time, whether now or never so many myriads of ages hence, resolved to do whatever I think to be my duty, and most for the good and advantage of mankind in general, resolved so to do whatever difficulties I meet with, how many whatsoever, and how great whatsoever. Number 2, resolved to be continually endeavoring to find out some new contrivance and invention to promote the aforementioned things. 3, if ever I shall fall and grow dull, so as to neglect to keep any part of these resolutions, to repent of all I can remember when I come to myself again. 4, never to do any manner of thing, whether in soul or body, less or more, but what tends to the glory of God, nor suffer it if I can possibly avoid it. 5, never to lose one moment of time, but to improve it in the most profitable way I possibly can. 6, to live with all my might while I do live. 7, never to do anything which I should be afraid to do if it were the last hour of my life. 8, to act in all respects, both speaking and doing, as if nobody had been so vile as I, and as if I had committed the same sins or had the same infirmities or failings as others, and that I will let the knowledge of their failings promote nothing but shame in myself, and prove only an occasion of my confessing my own sins and misery to God. Number 9, to think much on all occasions of my dying and of the common circumstances which attend death. 10, when I feel pain, to think of pains of martyrdom and hell. 11, when I think of any theorem in divinity to be solved, immediately to do what I can towards solving it, if circumstances do not hinder. 12. If I take delight in gratification of pride or vanity, or on any such account, immediately to throw it by. 13. To be endeavored to find out fit objects of liberality and charity. 14. Never do anything out of revenge. 15. Never to suffer the least motion of anger towards irrational beings. 16. Never to speak evil of anyone, so that it shall tend to his dishonor, more or less, upon no account except for some real good. 17. That I will live so as I shall wish I had done when I come to die. 18. To live so at all times as I think is best in my most devout frames, and when I have the clearest notions of things of the gospel and another world. 19. Never do anything which I should be afraid to do if I expected it would not be above an hour before I should hear the last trump. 20. To maintain the strictest temperance in eating and drinking. 21. Never to do anything which, if I should see in another, I should count a just occasion to despise him for, or think any way more than meanly of him. 22. To endeavor to obtain for myself as much happiness in the other world as I possibly can, with all the power, might, vigor, and vehemence, yet violence, I am capable of or can bring myself to exert in any way that can be thought of. 23. Frequently to take some deliberate action which seems most unlikely to be done for the glory of God, to trace it back to its original intention, design, and ends of it. And if I find it not to be for God's glory, to repute it as any breach of the fourth resolution. So anyhow, you get a sense of this. It'll take me more time than we've got to go through all of these. But if you do want a copy of this, some real thought-provoking stuff. I know there's some phraseology that may be a little bit archaic to the modern ear today, but some rich things to think upon and to, increase the caliber of our own Christianity and convictions, and making good use of the time that the Lord has given to us. So, any thoughts or final comments that you want to make, or questions that you have? Yes, sir.
Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on, it says his congregation rejected him over the question of church membership?
Yeah, as I understand.
His concept of membership versus theirs.
Can
you explain that a little better?
Yeah, I don't know that I have the definitive answer, because I was actually asked to teach this class yesterday and listen to this lecture. But it had to do with what was known as the halfway covenant. Do you? Okay, yeah, do you want? Yeah.
They, like Solomon's daughter, his grandfather, they believe there had to be like it's kind of like a Wesleyan thing where it's like there had to be some instance of salvation. Like there had to be a distinct time they could point to. So like 1 in 9 people were not part of the church officially because they didn't actually have that moment to point to. So it was like, that was the division. Edwards was like, it's okay. That's not how the covenant works, and he argued against that.
Yeah, so the halfway covenant where, so much what we would say revival was going on in the Great Awakening that I think Jonathan Edwards early on would say everyone's converted. So anyone who wanted to join the church could just join by virtue of the fact that they were local. But when that started to diminish, as Godfrey is pointing out, when spirituality diminished, there began to be doubts about the true conversion of people. So now, how do you regulate that church membership? Solomon Stoddard was viewing the Lord's Supper as if you partake in the Lord's Supper, that supper would actually bring conversion. Well, people were taking the Lord's Supper, but their lives weren't consistent with conversion. So Edward starts to go back to his father, who was more conservative than Solomon Stoddard was, Jonathan Edwards' grandfather. So he went back to sort of, you need to make a profession of faith. You need to demonstrate that you do know what salvation is about and give a testimony before we take you into membership. So it began to be more doctrinally oriented and not just on virtue of the fact that you could be a part of a emotional kind of evidence of at least some working of the Spirit of God in people. That's the way I would understand it.
The vote
One more.
200 voted against him, 23 voted for him.
Oh wow, 200 to 20. I didn't know what the vote. Yeah, wow. Does that answer the question? Is that
A little
helpful?
bit.
Yeah.
Now, who is the Solomon? I kind of missed it.
Solomon Stoddard is Jonathan Edwards' grandfather.
Okay, I got
Yeah.
it. He was also a minister?
Yeah, he was a minister, and when Jonathan Edwards was, what Godfrey brings out is he's sort of wowed by creation, right? You look at the evidence of God and the ordering of this world, and he's wowed. How could this ever happen? We would say by chance, right? This is before Darwin really comes out. So he is wowed by creation. And so his father, who was very much more of a kind of a doctrinal precision kind of a guy, Solomon Stoddard was a little bit more loose. I don't want to use loose, but a little bit less rigid, I would say. And so Jonathan Edwards goes and works for Solomon Stoddard, goes to his church and starts working with his grandfather. I think it was 15 when he started working for him. But his father, remember, Jonathan Edwards' father didn't believe this, creation infatuation was really evidence that he had been converted. That wasn't the way, yeah. All right, well, let's close in prayer, and we'll go. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time that we've had here. Thank you for the gifts and the legacy of Jonathan Edwards, what he has done in challenging the church to think about things from a spiritual point as well as from a theological point. I pray that you would help us to learn the lessons of history, to be imitators, of Jonathan Edwards, insofar as he is an imitator of you. And we just thank you for the way you give us great gifted men like this. And so please bless us today as we come to our time of worship. And may we think well upon these things that we've learned today. For your glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay.